You're listening to the West Coast Truth with your host, Russell Scott.
On tonight's program, author of the cult classic, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, Dr. Nick Begich.
Dr. Nick Begich, welcome to the West Coast Truth.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
For the audience who doesn't know who you are, who is Nick Begich?
I am an independent science writer and researcher. I've written 5 books and surrounding technology issues, primarily military technologies, over the last 15 years. I've been reporting on the HAARP issue, among other things. I also have a background in education. I was twice elected president of the Alaska Federation of Teachers, the Anchorage Council of Education. I've worked as a tribal administrator here in Alaska, as well as a consultant for tribal governments. Traveled quite extensively. I've given over 3,000 radio interviews, several hundred lectures, primarily on science areas. I also come from a political family. My father was a United States Congressman. My brother's a United States Senator. And I've been involved in politics most of my life in the region that I live in, which is actually Alaska, quite a ways from most people, but a wonderful place to be and where I'm coming to you from today.
Quite connected then. Yeah,
I think a little bit. It's interesting. You meet a lot of people in the course of life, and of course that gives a little bit of dimension to the way you think about things. And the political background's been useful. I've certainly had exposure and opportunities to meet people literally all over the world. I've been an expert witness in the European Parliament, testified on weapon systems there, as well as written for a number of publications throughout Europe. So you get around, you meet people, and it actually gives a lot more dimension to your thinking, and I think kind of lends itself towards looking for those solutions. And radio, of course, is one of my favorite venues. It's a good way to get people educated on issues that otherwise are pretty complicated.
Well, I bought your book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, which I'm sure most people are familiar with that are into the HAARP thing. It's old, though. It's been around. It was from 1995, which I couldn't believe.
Right.
I mean, I've only been hearing about this for, last 5-6 years, maybe.
Right. That's it's interesting, is because we've been at it a long time, and I think on a lot of issues they sort of come and go, and that's what most people expect. On this one, it's stayed with us quite a while. Now 17 years discussing this issue from its very inception through the various developments of the HAARP program and the site, and more recently, they maintain pretty good testing regime out there, but. Yeah, it's been an ongoing issue, and of course the project was a multi-phase project from its inception, and that has proven to be exactly the case. Over the time, which is another test of time, the things we concluded, the things we believed then, none of that have we changed our mind about. In fact, as time has gone on, it's only proven to be correct. I mean, in terms of what we anticipated and expected the system to be able to produce.
Well, you probably answered this question thousands of times, so. There it is. What is HAARP?
Okay, HAARP is the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. It was a joint effort originally of the Air Force and Navy and the Geophysical Institute at the University of Fairbanks. It switched over to DARPA in 2003, but essentially it's an array or field of antennas that focus or concentrate radio frequency energy into a relatively small area. The intention is to agitate an area above the Earth's surface called the ionosphere. And by being able to manipulate the radio frequency energy on the ground, you can then control some environmental factors. You can interact with the magnetic lines of force that surround the planet. You can also interact with the ionosphere, this layer that begins about 30 feet above the Earth's surface. And in so doing, you have some pretty interesting potentials for weapons applications, which is why the military was so interested in this project and why it's been funded continuously now for 17 years.
You said DARPA. I don't want to forget about that. Can you tell the audience what that is?
Sure, DARPA does predominantly classified research for the various branches of the military intelligence groups, as well as the main military groups, Air Force, Navy, Marines, etc. But DARPA does the really advanced research efforts, and these are some of the most classified projects in the country. And this one sort of shifted out of Air Force and Navy over to them because it does have multi-agency uses, as well as just the very, very classified nature of much of the research that takes place there.
Is HAARP an attempt to manipulate the weather?
Well, this is interesting. There's some of the applications that come out. One of them that Dr. Riesland, the inventor, came up with early on was this idea of manipulating weather systems or manipulating weather systems. And initially, when he first designed HAARP, and this is going back to his first ideas in the 80s, he believed it would take prodigious amounts of energy in order to accomplish that. Now, he later revised his ideas, and he actually said you could manipulate weather systems with 1,600 times less energy than you originally anticipated. And this was because he found that you could actually manipulate what are called gravitational waves. And by manipulating these, also manipulate a good deal of weather activity. Now, underneath that, there was another thought when he first came out with this idea of being able to heat the ionosphere, which is actually what these instruments originally did, going back even to instruments, early versions that were developed by the former Soviet Union. The heating of the ionosphere pushes the ionosphere out. So imagine 30 feet, or 30 miles rather, above the Earth's surface, and then pushing a 30-mile diameter column out into space, perhaps a couple 100 miles. In so doing, atmosphere then moves into that space, and in so doing, pressure systems below are altered, as well as jet streams can be altered. So in that sense, you can manipulate weather. On the other side of that, the idea of moving a jet stream around, I mean, you don't have to watch the news very much to realize how much that plays into where weather ends up, how severe storms can be. Jet streams are really the transport system, if you will. And so manipulating these is sort of the root, again, of where those systems end up. Manipulating pressure systems, obviously, also push those systems around. So this pretty basic things that HAARP can do, even at its current stage of development. The idea of manipulating gravitational waves then opens up the door for other controversy surrounding the device, particularly as it relates to this whole concept of geophysical manipulation, the idea of weather, manipulating weather, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, this type of thing, that starts to come up when people start looking into HAARP. And it's not isolated. The fact is, it was the last Secretary of Defense, it was April 27th, 1997, he was commenting on weapons of mass destruction, international terrorism, and this is back, it was during a news briefing after a conference on this, and he was attending this with Secretary Lugar and Nunn back at the time. Now remember, this is pre-9/11. We're talking quite a ways back, 1997, and this is what the Secretary of Defense said, and it's a one-line quote, and it reads, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter a climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. Now, when you think about that, from a seated at that time, Clinton's Secretary of Defense, making that comment that, hey, we could manipulate the weather, we could create earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, terrorist organizations having that capability, mind you, using electromagnetic waves.
But couldn't that
energy itself as a stimulus for this type of activity.
But could that not just be posturing? You hear the Russians claiming all sorts of things.
No, I don't think so at all, because when you take this, it's not just the Russians, but we were involved in this research also. In fact, you can go back to the mid-1970s where we signed a treaty with Russia and 60 other countries to not use geophysical manipulation as a weapon of war. That predates some of the other treaties that we signed off on, and the reason was everyone was advancing so rapidly in this area and was afraid, quite frankly, that experimentation and the downstream or unanticipated effects of that could be just devastating. So the consequence was everybody backed off. I don't think it was posturing at all. There's been enough in the open literature, even private companies offering services using electrostatics and other methods for triggering weather events. So I think it's a pretty serious issue these days. I don't think posturing so much. In fact, it was Rumsfeld during the Bush administration that called for the abandonment of the environmental treaties, primarily because we had figured it out. And the idea, from his perspective, of waging covert war, particularly by just manipulating weather, would give you the absolute plausible deniability you want in such instances. In fact, you might even yield a better result after the natural disaster actually being invited in to help clean up the mess. So, from a military perspective, at least for some of the thinkers that were involved in this, it's a pretty exciting area of science.
But this isn't the first time the government or big science has tried to manipulate the weather. This is...
Oh, no. In fact, it goes back quite a ways. It goes back... in fact, the biggest things that people remember, if they remember any of it at all, were cloud seeding experiments during the Vietnam War to create stronger and harder rainstorms to bog down the enemy, if you will. The Rainmaker 1, Rainmaker 2 programs operated out of White Sands, New Mexico, and experimental labs run by the government years ago, and even in the 60s and 70s, these were experiments going on. Quite a bit even shows up in the open literature in terms of military advances in the area, from fog, control environments for creating fog and again bogging down your adversary's ability to fight. All this shows up in the open literature coming in from, say, the 60s all the way into the current time frame, an area of great interest to military planners. The problem is, if it isn't obvious, is that once you start doing this in one area, the downstream, unanticipated, unexpected effects can be quite dangerous. And I think that's where certainly we get a little bit excited about it. Even Ben Eastland, the inventor of HAARP, on the weather modification issues, decided that the military probably wasn't the best place for this work to take place. He felt if it took place at all, it should be in the open light of day with a lot of scrutiny and a very, very slow pace. He passed away in 2007, unfortunately, but he was not handing off his ideas anymore on weather modification just because he didn't feel it was a safe way to proceed with military planners.
They were detonating nuclear bombs into the ionosphere in, the late 60s?
Right. And, that was, again, this was crazy stuff today as we look back on it. I mean, just the idea of even contemplating this kind of experiment. But, you have to remember, everyone sort of has a view that goes through their own knothole, whether they really see the full effect of what they're saying, what they're planning. This is a problem, and it continues to be a problem as we advance more powerful weapon systems. The whole nuclear thing, if you think about how many atmospheric detonations were made, how many underground detonations were made, this reached into many thousands. The effect of that, the long-range effect of that, I think it's a lot of scientists are talking about it in terms of risk, but no one has really done much except realize at some point it had to stop. It did stop, slowed way down. There's very little of that now, if at all, and primarily because everyone realized that the risks involved. But think about how many decades we engaged in those risks in any case, and the same is true now with these more sophisticated systems. The advantage of some of these, they don't leave the residual. You get great destruction potential, but you don't leave the residual radioactive wasteland behind you. And so from that perspective, they're a bit more desirable. Again, weapons of mass destruction, huge weapon systems that use the Earth itself as part of that weapon is a whole new concept in terms of what we can do technologically today. We just have a lot more ability to do that today as we gain a greater and greater understanding of how these systems work.
To follow up on the nuke thing, is that what caused the hole in the ozone layer?
A lot of people have blamed it on aerosol cans and certain chemicals that actually are heavier than air don't make it that high up. Yeah, I think so. And the other thing that contributes to it that people don't consider is every time we launch a satellite, every time we launch a space vehicle, we go right up through this layer. We deposit chemicals right there. In fact, the place it was first observed was with Skylab's launch, where we actually created a hole in the ozone. It took several hours as it was observed to finally fill in, and they go, oh, that's okay, it all filled in. What they didn't consider is the fact that it's like throwing a rock in the sea. You know, the rock goes in, you have a little bit of a void, and it fills back in. The same is true here. The Earth turns, things move, appears to fill in, but do you net, in the net of it, do you deplete it? I think so, and I think the larger contribution, equal to trillions of cans of aerosol spray, are these launches that have deposited the chemical and the chemistry necessary to create those reactions. That's probably more the cause, although you very rarely, if ever, hear governments taking any responsibility. They'd prefer to blame it on your deodorant.
Hey, you probably heard of that proposed space elevator.
Right.
So that's probably not a very good idea then. You would have a permanent puncture then in the ozone. Well,
it would depend on how they, how they operate such a thing. You know, it's really the gases that come off of the aircraft as it lifts that causes those reactions. These lifts, if I understand it, are suspended in some kind of a low orbit. I don't know. It seems like a pretty impossible sort of thing, but we'll see what they do. The idea of lifting things off the planet by a synchronous satellite with a cable just seems like such an odd mechanical way of accomplishing something.
Yeah, we'll but see. HAARP would be unimaginable in the 1800s too. So.
Oh, sure. And here's the thing about power sources. This is something that people don't realize either with HAARP. These low-orbiting space platforms was actually part of HAARP's configuration and planning, because by focusing radio frequency energy, you actually end up also with a power transmission system, the ability to wirelessly move energy. This was one of the thoughts with HAARP originally, was we concentrate radio frequency energy, we could bounce it off of reflectors back to Earth, to some other place on the Earth, and then reconfigure that energy into the electrical grid. But think about it from a standpoint of keeping fueled low-orbiting space platforms, no longer needing to transport by shuttle or other means fuel to keep them aloft, but being able to literally pump energy in from the ground wirelessly. This gets pretty exciting. In fact, the very first tests of HAARP concepts in the 80s was this one concept, and they proved by experimentation in Canada that we could actually pull that off. And in so doing, totally revolutionizes the area of low-orbiting space platforms, being able to keep them aloft for perhaps up to 10,000, 20,000-hour missions, never having to send fuel up in the conventional way. That is a huge, huge breakthrough in terms of potential, something that's been looked for since at least the 1960s. And in fact, the very same scientists researching it in the 1960s were the ones in the early stages of HAARP looking at this concept again, only this time using the HAARP system as a power delivery system, if you will.
We'll take a break with today's guest, Dr. Nick Begich.
Smart meter hacking. Have you heard about it? Probably not. Fact. Older analog meters required a BC Hydro employee to come out to your house and physically cut off your power. Fact. With smart meters, that task is now just a keystroke away. Fact. Computer hackers have had the ability to hack into the new smart meters like the ones BC Hydro is installing in your home since 2009. Funny how you hear very little about it. Get informed. Know the facts. This message brought to you by smartmeterblocker.com. smartmeterblocker.com.
With nothing but his computer, an identity thief is able to use your information to open a bank account in order to make your money his money. You need LifeLock, the only identity theft protection company that now monitors bank accounts for takeover fraud. LifeLock, relentlessly protecting your identity. Call 1-800-LifeLock or go to lifelock.com today.
This is John Fresco. Have you heard about the Venus Project? Check it out on thevenusproject.com. We cover many things with videos and books. One of the books is called The Best That Money Can't Buy. It'll give you an overview of the Venus Project and its architectural proposals to help solve the problems toward sustainability. Many of the problems that confront society today, war, poverty, hunger, are dealt with as you investigate the Venus Project. You'll find many different solutions.
We're back with Dr. Nick Begich. So how does the bloody thing work?
Well, it's essentially, again, it's an array or field of antennas, and by focusing or concentrating the radio frequency energy, you create these unusual effects. And the way that's done is actually it's a field of 180 antennas today. These antennas that are fired in a specific sequence that creates a cyclotron resonance, which would be visually sort of a corkscrewing motion where the energy is focusing or concentrating to a relatively small area. Once it does that, it's able to send energy up at a much higher energy concentration than is normally thought of associated with radio frequency energy, because the energy normally operates under the same principles as, say, the energy coming off of a flashlight. You know, you take a flashlight, you shine it up against a wall, and the beam is small at the source of the light, and as it hits the wall, of course, it's a lot larger, and the further you get away, the larger it is, or the less dense it becomes, less concentrated, more spread out it becomes. Radio frequency energy behaves the same way under normal conditions, but when you concentrate it or focus it, by analogy, it's similar by analogy to what you do with light and a laser. You know, a laser keeps the light compact, tight. In this case, the radio frequency energy, HAARP, keeps tight and compact. Once you manipulate that energy by pulsing and shaping the energy, then you get an opportunity to couple with the natural forces that surround the Earth. You know, and we've heard a couple of issues regarding this. One is, you know, how much power is involved, and you know, it's the effective radiated power, which is a formulation that tells you what's kind of coming off the array and how it's affecting the area where the energy is being sent. The effective radiated power is not the input power, and this creates some confusion about how these systems actually work. It's not billions of watts in and billions of watts out. It's megawatts in and then effective radiated power, the way you measure it, potentially billions of watts of ERP, effective radiated power. Now, when Ben invented the device, he anticipated it continuing to grow in size and scale, and that ERP continuing to rise. That's kind of the way the energy works, but by manipulating it is where you get the real exciting effects. The other thing is, it's coherent energy. It's energy that's controlled and rhythmic. There appears to be certain resonances where energy is triggered to be released in the upper ionosphere. As an example, at Stanford University, they pumped VLF, very low frequency energy, into the upper ionosphere where it couples with the magnetosphere, and the observation there was that it actually amplified the delivered energy by 1,000 times. Now think about this. The energy coming off the ground hits this area. All of a sudden the energy builds to 1,000 times what it should be. And what they discovered was that certain window frequencies, like dialing in a radio where you get harmony or resonance between the transmitter and receiver and you get a nice clear signal, the same was true with our natural environment. Certain frequencies of energy trigger the release of natural energy, energy that's already there and available. In this case, in the ionosphere, some of that energy was able to amplify the signal by 1,000-fold. That's what this instrument is really designed to do, is to capture natural energy and then be able to build on that. So think about it as a primer on the end of a bullet. You know, the gunpowder is a larger amount of energy. The primer just gets everything rolling. HAARP is a primer for natural energy systems within the Earth and being able to manipulate those specifically for military purposes.
Who funds this?
This was, again, it's
Is the
funded
Rockefeller
by...
Foundation?
No, this is all government funding. This is all funded by now DARPA, but of course earlier versions, Air Force and Navy. And when you aggregate the money, I mean, it's people in military terms look at this and go, well, it's just cab fare. It's a small money. You know, it's a few $100 million over many years. But the thing is, this is ionospheric research, basic research. It comes from 40 years, 50 years worth of research in this area. When you go back to some of the earlier concepts, you go back to the Soviet transmitters of the 60s and 70s and carry that research forward. So it's not just HAARP. It's everything that has fed it over many decades, and that's where we're at on the system today. It's a developmental prototype. Yes, these systems exist they exist in Europe. They exist across Canada. The former systems, of course, in the Soviet Union as well.
Wouldn't Antarctica be the best spot for one of these HAARP machines?
Well, actually, the northern regions work out well because you have the magnetic field lines, which are essentially the energies running from the South Pole into the northern regions. But these natural lines of force actually act as wave guides. If you pump the energy in the northern regions, the energy will actually corkscrew around it. So if you could visualize, it would be like a spring wrapped around a wire, and that energy being that spring moving from north to south. And the purpose of that type of acceleration and using those as wave guides was to create a global shield, a shield for intercontinental ballistic missiles or other craft coming into coming in from outer space into our atmosphere. Intercontinental ballistic missiles in particular would hit this region of accelerated electrons, and it would cause bit errors on the onboard avionics, the things that control the flight, causing those craft to malfunction. So from a global shielding perspective, that became a pretty exciting thing. In fact, if you in the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, we actually have a view graph that was used by the inventor Ben Eastland when he was first fielding these concepts to the military, and actually that was one of the ones that was seized on immediately. And even in most recent days, in the last few days, as a matter of fact, there's been discussion about the inadequacy of our missile shield for rogue states such as North Korea and Iran. So we're back to the same equations as many years later, but this type of technology could in fact shield us from not just rogue states, but major nuclear powers as well.
So then is HAARP merely a rebranding of Star Wars?
Oh, I've always said that. In fact, Gene Manning and I, when we first wrote on the subject, we believed absolutely that it was a rebranding. It was basically a ground-based versus a space-based system. And if you think about the practicality of that, being able to get to a facility, repair it, maintain it, fuel it, etc., from the ground is certainly much more advantageous, much more cost-effective. So all it did is move from space to ground, as much of it as we could, and then utilizing natural forces, natural energy as the primary driver behind the system. So, again, emphasizing, what we spoke about earlier, the idea of taking a small amount of energy, man-made energy, and then manipulate the vast amounts of natural energy in our system. And that's essentially what HAARP does.
Can you explain the importance of the magnetosphere and the ionosphere? I mean, are these terms interrelated? I get a little bit confused with the two.
They're layers. If you look at the layering that occurs around the Earth, this energetic layering actually protects us from incoming particle streams, energy streams that would make life otherwise impossible on the Earth. The ionosphere actually is shielding us as a magnetosphere from these particles coming from the sun and other sources to protect us from essentially what otherwise would be a pretty inhospitable environment. So these are important layers for us, for the Earth. Not all planets have an ionosphere, in terms of how that works and how that is. It's one of the factors that makes it possible to inhabit the planet. When you think about, again, think about the planet as a giant motor spinning on its axis, generating electromagnetic fields, and these fields have interactions with any charged particles coming in from from space, which is exactly what they do. At the same time, these layers being charged will provide us opportunities for things on the ground, like radio. I mean, the idea of being able to bounce a signal off the ionosphere so that you get a signal literally around the world. Shortwave works that way. Very important, factors for terrestrial communication. When the ionosphere is even disturbed, communications all over the Earth can be disturbed, as well as under extreme solar activities, you even get interruptions of the power grid and problems with power systems.
Are you saying with HAARP you could theoretically shut off all radio communication worldwide?
One of the ideas was that you could disturb the ionosphere sufficiently to disrupt communications around the world, or at least on a hemispheric basis, and then be able, because you're manipulating those signals, be able to carry communications of your own. In other words, deny your adversary and yet carry your own communications, which in a warfare situation can be pretty easily understood for its merit. And that was one of the primary ideas, when HAARP first started, was this communication issue. The other was enhancing communication systems by stabilizing the ionosphere during times of solar storms and so on, so communications can be maintained. So both extremes have been and are being explored by HAARP and the facility experimenters. I mean, that's a big part of the whole thing. Ionospheric research always centered first around communications, and then from there, more exotic possibilities started to emerge. But that's really where it started.
Does this have any correlation with Project Bluebeam, or is that something entirely different?
Bluebeam is that idea of holographic projection, and it is entirely different.
Okay.
Again, you get into this realm of more exotic weapons based on energy systems. People confuse them a bit, or at least see the overlap. And the real overlap is the fact that they're energy-based. They're intended to do other things besides just tear tissue, like the old style ordnance, bombs and bullets. It's changed. It's changing even more dramatically, and will continue into the future as we get into particle beam weapons, space-based lasers, and other technologies that just really obsolete the old ordnance, bullets and bombs. In fact, military calls this period in our history a revolution in military affairs, similar to what we experienced in Europe in the Middle Ages when gunpowder was brought in from China, or during the atomic age.
The longbow is the other one, I guess. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. But each of these, as you look at each of these revolutions, when they came in, I mean, we go from one system to another. Last century, atomic weapons. This century will be electromagnetic weapons, particle beams, lasers.
Are we not going to destroy the Earth in the process, though? I mean, I've just spoken with one of the world's leading experts on bees, and we're destroying the world's natural frequency.
Yes, I think we are, to a great degree, interrupting the natural rhythms of the planet. Will we do enough to create enough damage to destroy things on a massive scale beyond what we've already done? Probably so, just because it's unfortunately our nature. We tend to run the wrong direction an awful long distance before we snap back. I think in these areas it's the same. In fact, the observations of electromagnetic field effects on living organisms, goes back a lot of years, but the governments of the world in setting regulation on these things is not caught up. Russian standards were even 1,000 times more stringent than U.S. standards in terms of electromagnetic exposures, things that would affect living organisms. Not to say that they enforced their laws, but at least they understood the mechanisms and at least put them on the books. But this, when you start talking about bee populations, or in the case of Europe, there was an observation on certain pine trees with a certain needle length that corresponded to the wavelength of certain broadcasts, caused those trees to die en masse throughout Central Europe. That was observed years and years ago. What has happened differently is Europeans tend to look at some of these things under the precautionary principle, setting up regulatory regimes way before we do. Before we have the 10 scientists stand up and say, "Oh, we've all run the same test and it's bad news." They tend to start to report some of the bad news early on, giving people an opportunity to make decisions perhaps different than they otherwise would, including policymakers. Under the precautionary principle, Europeans have not yet been wrong on health or environmental issues, and I suspect in this regime they won't be wrong either. And we've been working with Europeans quite some time on this issue, going back even to our testimony in the European Parliament back in 1998, late 98. resulted in resolutions in '99, and later some scientific studies began looking at this stuff. But this all takes so much time that by the time the science catches up with the events in the real world, damage has been done, and damage is being done today. I know in your part of the country, you've had some pretty extreme weather events. We always have comments regarding HAARP when the weather shifts so darn much. There is a lot of things going on in this field, and what I can say is that as we progress in these areas, as militaries continue to experiment in these areas, I believe we'll see more anomalous weather. We'll see more anomalous events as sort of we trip over ourselves trying to discover where the thresholds are and where the safety levels of these technologies are. And unfortunately, when military planners engage in this kind of work, you don't always get the safety that you otherwise would hope would be built in.
Well, I live in Vancouver, so the only odd weather I've been experiencing was this month of sun that we had.
Well, congratulations on that. We're well into fall where I am. I'm north of you another 1,400 miles. I'm up in north of Anchorage, so we've got snow halfway down our mountains and fall well underway, and not too many more weeks left.
Is HAARP on now? Is it always on, or does it?
HAARP is not always on. It's a development of prototype. It runs what are called campaigns. So periodically, an agency or a university or someone doing academic work will be given the opportunity to use the instrument for a period of days or weeks to run their experiments, and that's pretty much the standard way. Now, they have operated it a lot more than we ever expected, just because there is a lot of demand for the instrument. So not all the time, but a good deal of the time, it is indeed running, and it is available, as I said, to all branches of the military, various academic institutions doing government research. But it is primarily, and is in fact, a DARPA research center, which puts it under the hands of really the most classified of military research.
We'll take a break with today's guest, Dr. Nick Begich.
Are you a smoker by any chance? No? Are you guys smokers by any chance? No? The group behind me are not smokers. Just a hunch. Did you smoke by any chance? No? Okay. Are you smokers by any chance? You smoke cigarettes? How long have you been smoking?
10 years.
How many years have you been smoking?
I smoked for over 30 years.
How many years do you smoke?
55.
I smoked for a very long time, and I wanted to change.
Cigarette butts, all that kind of stuff?
It was everywhere.
Right, and would you smoke in bed, if I'm not mistaken?
I've been reviewing, looking around which e-cigarette I should buy.
How much dough do you think you spend on cigarettes?
20 a day.
You spend $20 a day? That's almost a house.
I don't know, I'm terrible with math. $2,000 a month, I don't know.
So you could be in a much nicer place, let's say, if you were to say.
I could actually pay rent.
Like $13 a pack, so pack every 3 days.
Yeah.
So whatever that is.
Another really great thing about green smoke, one cartomizer lasts me about a day and a half. To get that kind of nicotine off of an analog cigarette, I'd probably have to spend around $7,000 a year. There's no mess, there's no ashes, I don't stink.
No smell.
No smell.
No smell, no fire, no ash. Do you want to try it?
Yeah, I'll give it a go.
Okay. Interesting how that is with a regular cigarette. I will hold this disgusting thing. Why don't you try that? That, by the way, vapor, no smoke, no ash, no smoke.
Really like the menthol flavor, the mocha flavor, and the real tobacco flavor.
Try that. We've got mocha in there for you. Now try that just like you would a regular cigarette. How's the flavor?
It tastes like mocha.
It's a nice, clean, sweet taste.
Two flavors, all there, and that's how you charge it. You just plug it into your USB, plug it into the computer. That acts as the battery. Illegal to smoke in the park.
I didn't know.
I won't rat you out. I won't call the cops on you. Illegal to smoke in the cab, right?
Illegal, guilty.
and now you're littering. So that's you've got two illegal things going on at the same time.
In New York City, they made a new law that you can't smoke in parks. So I can do this there, and if a policeman comes up to me, I just show him this card, which says this is not a cigarette.
With green smoke, I feel comfortable smoking almost everywhere.
Like a cigarette, honestly.
It's the same as a cigarette.
It's very good. It's better than a cigarette.
I think the green smoke is great.
We're back with Dr. Nick Begich. Dr. Nick, you were the lead expert on conspiracy theory with Jesse Ventura.
Right. I was on a segment with on HAARP, the same topic of today, and it was his lead, his first segment. A lot of reaction to it because it's been around a while. People are just now even tripping over it as an issue, and yet, we've been reporting on it quite a long time. The idea of conspiracy. Now, this is always interesting to me because you always have these military planners talking about all these conspiracy theorists, and in my view, I always have this awkward view of it because family being involved in government a long time, I kind of understand the role of the military, and it is to be the ultimate conspiracy theorist. I mean, think about it. The military plans for every horrible thing that you could ever imagine and then builds a plan around it of how to save us from it. I mean, that's conspiracy thinking. That's what our military does. That's what they're paid to do, actually, and when you stop and think about it, we're all glad they do it because if they can envision the worst of situations and build a plan around it, then when something less than that occurs, at least that we know there is a plan. From my perspective, that's their appropriate role, but it's also the reason why military and those associated with them are kept in the closet, so to speak. In democratic republics such as ours, we break out the military every once in a while. The civilian sector makes the judgment in a non-paranoid environment, unlike the military's environment. And then we bring them out to do what, unfortunately, they might have to do from time to time. That's why we separate the two. When you see military regimes around the world, it's pretty easy to understand the rationale behind that. When you see military governments operate and how they operate, and how they snuff out free thinking, how they snuff out free speech, how they snuff out the creative aspects that actually lead to a higher and better culture and society, that's why we have civil governments. And so when I look at military systems like this, and coming out of a political background, I think it does deserve, and we should, all of us, be engaged, at least in some scrutiny of our military machines, especially in the industrialized world, where they have the ability to literally snuff out large portions of the planet. And today now, with the newer technologies that the Rumsfelds of the world think are just wonderful, because now we can wage covert war by using weather systems, the Earth itself as a weapon of war, have absolute deniability, and yet have the destructive power of a hurricane, if you will. That is a big change, a big shift, and one that paranoid thinkers, military planners operating in a vacuum, operating under the guise of secrecy, should not be allowed to wield that level of power without a whole lot of oversight from people that are thinking a little bit differently.
On that note, would you advocate for a technocracy?
From the standpoint of technology, I think we already have that. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I think we have that. I think we have a government that utilizes technology in a way that controls and manipulates. I mean, take a look. If you go back in time a little bit, back to the 70s, you can read a book called Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski, which is a prediction of sort of what happens in a technological society as it advances, and it looks at the whole world. It looks at Africa, Asia, Europe, United States and Canada, Latin America. It looks everywhere. And the conclusions that come to in the 70s is quite remarkable, because here we are in 2012, headed into 2013, and his predictions might as well have been last week, because they all happened. Zbigniew Brzezinski, for those who don't remember, was one of the founders of the Trilateral Commission, speaking of conspiracies, and also National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter in 1976 when he was president. Prior to that, he was at Columbia University, where he wrote this particular book. I think when we start to look at where do the elites want to take us, and is that a conspiracy or a plan? It depends on where you're sitting. If you're in the planning center having a chit-chat with these guys, it's just a plan. If you're on the outside looking in and you see it working against your interest, it's a conspiracy. Somebody else is having the thought, and it isn't you. I think that really gets a bit confusing. If you start to think about people operating in their own self-interest, these elites operate in their own self-interest. It just happens to not be ours. In fact, in many cases, it works against us on a fundamental level, which is why we do need to be engaged. When you start to think about where's the money and power collected in the world today, it's the military, industrial, academic complex. It's those three working together where the big bucks are spent. The rest is chicken feed. I mean, take the whole federal budget, everything except Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. Take all the rest of it, and military spending is bigger than all the other departments combined, from agriculture to education. And I think that's, again...
So what, this drama of the healthcare dollar here, there, this is just that. It's drama. Theater.
Well, it is, and it is a lot of money also, but it certainly keeps us off the point. The point where the real money is being spent is in the trillion-dollar wars we're waging. It's like we're fighting a tiny town with a hammer that's way bigger than tiny town. But we're getting rid of a lot of old ordnance. We're bringing on some new weapon systems, and we're doing it under the guise of safety and security. And I don't think it was too many hundreds of years ago where somebody starting this country, at least in this country, the United States, suggested that, trading safety and security for liberty, we end up losing both. And I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's what we're seeing played out in the 21st century. We think we're getting safety and security. What we're really getting is the snuffing out of liberty, freedom, and our individual ability to pursue our own happiness. We see an overregulated country, both to our north, or in fact to my south in Canada, in the United States. In Europe, particularly, I'm with a good friend of mine here in Alaska today from Germany. Where we're headed is where they've been. Where we're going is where we don't want to be. And I can tell you, the stomping on liberty for security is a loss that gives the victory to the terrorists, gives the victory to our adversary, and steals the very life, the very blood, and the very breath out of Americans, Canadians, and those that have grown up in freedom. But that's what needs to change. The paranoid thinking of military planners, the paranoid thinking of governments that have used social issues to divide our countries. Well, industrialists will literally walk away with our industry, our banks, our livelihoods, and put us in virtual slavery. Think about Europeans today. They can't even print their own money. They're going to be slaves to get out of the economic turmoil they have there. At least in Canada and the United States, we can still run the presses a little longer. But ultimately, it all flows back on us, and the decisions that are being made are being driven by really the wrong things. Economics is what's driving the destruction of our economies, and a lot of that is the misplacement of money in military-industrial complex. Healthcare systems, the only reason we don't have one in the United States that's working is because we've allowed corruption within the industry destroy it and make it uneconomic. At the same time, the models that have been done in Europe have been done because largely we're paying for the military for the rest of the world. It's all a question of where does your money go and how is it organized and how much power do you give lobbyists. We don't even negotiate our medical prices for pharmaceuticals at the national level, and we're the biggest buyer in the world. So we're just at the mercy of these companies who can pay a few million in lobbying efforts and actually control our Congress. And knowing it from the inside, that is how it works. It's not a conspiracy, it's a reality, and the reality works against us.
As a side note, it's now law in Italy that all transactions over €1,000 must be done in debit card form or credit card. And
right.
Talk about taking away their liberties.
Well, and this is, we just went through this with a friend of mine trying to return to Europe.
Yeah.
Trying to return to Europe, and we hear this thing where he bought precious metals here in the United States. Well, heck, $2,500 in commodities being shipped, and the precious metal is one. You got to declare it, or they'll take it away from you and keep it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of the CINFIN, CINFIN system. If people look at my book, Earth Rising: The Revolution, published in 2000, we warned of the CINFIN system, which will track every transaction of any size and coordinate all of your money transactions and your financial business into one place so it can be analyzed. The Italians are just a little ahead of it by demanding that electronic transfers of 1,000 or more. Wait till it's 10 cents or more. Wait till it's all transactions and all your money is electronic. All of it is controlled, manipulated, and registered to some government agency as they take their cut.
Well, I don't think they'll do that. I'll tell you why. Sorry to cut you off. They need that money going around so the government themselves can launder it, be involved in the drug trade.
Yeah, that's probably right. They'll have to have a cap on it because they got to cover their own corruption. You know, when the Egyptians, we threatened to pull back their aid, it wasn't just the aid, it was the money flowing to all the Swiss bank accounts for all of their generals. That was the money we actually did cut off temporarily till they freed those American citizens supposedly involved in their elections. The reality is we got two sets of books. We got the set of books that everybody waves the flag around and we're helping all these people. We've got the set of books which is the one rolling into people's private bank accounts to keep governments under our control. You know, think about that. If you're a private corporation in the United States and you do that overseas, in the United States you go to jail, but our government does it routinely all over the world, corrupting governments, blackmailing people, digging through their trash. I mean, come on. This is America. This is freedom. This is liberty. This is what it's reduced to. I don't think most of us in the free world believe that's the way it ought to roll. And it's no mystery once we realize that you got someone digging through your trash that you might make your neighbor mad. The fact is, we engage in the very activity that we say we despise, and our governments do it on our behalf as our proxies in the world, leaving us really, I think, in a position of even greater vulnerability as we're scrutinized around the world. And it's not.
Well, they've shown their cards now.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah,
and they're a little more blatant about it. And the other part of it is it's a little easier to find out about because of the way communication works in the world, at least at the moment. That's something to be pretty happy about. We at least have the semblance of freedom of speech, even if it is 100% monitored. We can at least say it before they come and collect us up. And hopefully we don't see that happen in the United States. Hopefully in the free world we recognize the changes, and at the same time we take control of our governments in a little more vigorous way. You know, the average person in the United States is a non-voter. Look at the population. Half the people don't even register, and of those, less than half actually show up. And of them, half of them decide on any given issue, which reduces you to about 12% of the population deciding what happens within any kind of voting matrix. Get involved. Do something. It's that time of year again. Hold politicians' feet to the fire. Make them feel the pressure of the citizen rather than the pressure of the corporation, and maybe things will flow a different direction. And I think coming from background in politics and science, science is the tool for the 21st century. Let it serve humanity, or it'll just serve the same kinds of institutions that have dominated mankind for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. The elites will rule it. If they can use technology to do it, they will. It's incumbent on all of us to stay engaged, involved, and not give up on the possibilities of seeing this world change.
You know, these elections are very close. If someone wins by 52%, that's a landslide now. If 48% of the population is unhappy with the choice that's been made, how can we defend democracy?
Well, you know, I think you got to go back. Every major change in history started with...
Do we not vote with our dollar?
Well, we vote. We vote with our dollars, and at the same time, I think we vote with our votes. We vote with our actions, and more importantly, it doesn't end at the voting booth. Most of us pull the lever, go back about our business. We can't do that anymore. We have to stay engaged at some level, talking to our neighbors, engaging our politicians, keeping people aware of what's important to us is even more important rather than falling in to apathy, which is so often the case. We're in a state where things are changing rapidly. A lot of people are experiencing upsets in their economies like they've never had before. it is just the beginning. What is happening economically, and as it overlays the rest of what we're seeing around the world, it will get much more difficult in the West, much more difficult in the industrialized nations, as the rest of the world tries to catch up, and as the basic economy shifts out of the industrialized world into the developing nations. And that's happening on steroids. It's going to continue to happen. We're going to see continual economic upset. At the same time, our budgets in the West are being stretched by a government that has just gotten way, way out of hand. I mean, the idea of controlling every single factor, the idea of, again, the safety and security paranoia that's now driving so much of how our government operates, how it spends, and how it looks at citizens. You know, we're looked at much differently as sort of the mob out there that's got to be controlled, rather than the citizen that needs to be lifted up, that needs to be sovereign as an individual and capable of doing things. We have a whole different view these days. I think we need to re-examine that in the advent of what's happened, dissipate the fear, replace it with a little more confidence in the direction we had. Fear creates incoherent brain patterns, kind associated with flight or fight responses, the kind that are associated not with the clear thinking that leads to solutions, but just the opposite. But that's what's inflicted on us today. The level of worry, fear, and anxiety absolutely shuts down the ability of the human mind to reach its higher states of awareness and consciousness, as creative states, the ones that lend themselves to solutions. Fear is the adversary, and fear is what's running rampant, and there's a surplus of it on the planet today, taking control of our individual directions to the extent that we can, doing what we can do, not what we can't do, what we absolutely believe we can do. We can each affect a sphere of influence that begins to impact this world in a different way, whether it's these issues that we've spoken about today or other issues that are of importance to people. The important issue is try, take an action, influence the people around you in a positive way. That's the way the world changes, not by waiting for some giant movement. We're already in it. The American Revolution was popular with 6%. 6% of the people, according to the record that I read of history. 6% woke up the rest of a nation and changed the face of the earth. That can happen again. It only takes a few to start to see things differently and express it into the world in a different way. That's how things change. That's how every major movement in science, politics, religion, and business ever began and ended, was on the note of one person or a handful seeing it differently and pursuing an agenda that led to change. And I think all of us are capable, again, of doing that in the 21st century. I think that's what's going to happen in this century. Things are going to change, and I think we see the turmoil before the calm in this one, and we're going to see a lot more. At the same time, I think we're going to see some big changes of a more positive.
Gandhi would be proud. Apathy, paranoia, fear can HAARP control the mind. We'll talk about this after our final break with today's guest, Dr. Nick Begich.
My name's Greg Palast. I'm an investigative reporter. In the year 2000, for BBC television, I discovered that Katherine Harris and Jeb Bush had removed thousands of black voters from the voter rolls of Florida. They called them felons, but their only crime was voting while black. In 2004, I discovered that the election was fixed by Karl Rove's crew by using a gimmick called voter caging. In 2008, for Rolling Stone, working with my co-investigator Bobby Kennedy, we uncovered how the GOP used a whole new panoply of gimmicks to destroy the civil rights of African American, Hispanic, and Native American voters. Now, in 2012, they're back. Theft of the election, part 4. But they're using a new weapon. It's called a bunch of billionaires. There are several billionaires who have opened up their checkbooks to buy a piece of real estate called 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. For 5 years, for BBC television, I've been investigating the big billionaires behind the GOP. No one else has been digging into the source of where these millions are coming from. But the investigation isn't over. nor is the reporting. I have an opportunity to place these reports on primetime television, to place these reports in major print media in the United States, to make a DVD, and by the way, to make a comic book so that the average voter can understand what's happening to them. We did this in 2008. 200,000 copies of Steal Back Your Vote, which went all over the country to activists, to Indian pueblos, to African American churches in Florida, wherever the vote was under threat. It had a big impact. We need to do it again in 2012. This isn't about partisan politics. This isn't about who you should vote for. This is about your right to have your vote counted, to have every American's vote counted. Now, I need your help. I'm coming to you because the big networks will now take my stories. I can get my investigations on the air and in print, but no one is going to put up the money to do the hardcore detective work and investigating that's the basis of our findings. If I have to crack open the files of the Secretary of State of Florida again, if I have to go to Colorado, to Utah, to Mexico, if I have to dig out the victims of the caging lists, I'm going to need to get on an airplane, can't flap my arms. I have to bring my cameramen, I'm going to have to bring my top investigators and put them on the case. That's going to require funds. Unless we have citizen funding, I can't do the investigation that protects your citizenship. That's why I'm coming to you. I'm asking you to make a personal commitment to join me in the investigation. I want your information. I want your commitment to get the word out, and I need your financial support too. I'm going to volunteer my time on this. Can you volunteer some of your assets? Can you volunteer some of your efforts? That's what I'd like to hear from you.
Truth is never far behind. You kept it hidden well. If I lived to tell the secret, I knew then. Will I ever have the chance again?
We're back with our final segment here with today's guest, Dr. Nick Begich. Thank you so much for being on the show. An honor to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me once again. And this been an interesting subject, and I know we've covered a lot of material in this last few segments, so see what we can do in the end of the program and kind of bring it all together. Hopefully we'll cover a couple more points.
Well, what has changed since you started the HAARP research? What has happened over the past 20 years?
The biggest thing that's happened, I think, in looking backwards, all this has been the awareness of people. It's certainly happened. More people are aware of HAARP and what its possibilities are. Hasn't slowed the program down too much. It's slowed it down a bit in the front end. They've been less, the planners have been less willing to talk with news media. They've shut that off for a number of years, using only their press conferences and their open houses every other year is kind of the way to let people know what's happening with it. But I think when I look back on all of it, remember it is a developmental prototype. It's designed to show concepts and then apply those concepts in various weapon systems around the world, which is exactly what they've been doing. Nothing's really changed in terms of our outlook on it. Ben Eastland has passed away. He died in 2007. He was a good friend. I got to know him quite a bit over the years, and I know on the weather modification issues, those were a big concern of his. He was involved in a conference on mind effects that I put together when I was with the Lay Institute to talk about that issue with a number of scientists from various disciplines, and really looking at sort of where does the technology go. And the biggest thing that came out of all the work that I did with HAARP was really more of a side effect, or at least one that they didn't advertise very much, but the idea that you could affect human beings' mental processes with these kinds of systems. To me, that's the biggest issue, the most important issue, not just with HAARP, but with a lot of other systems that can do the same.
Well, how would that work? How?
Well, essentially, you go back to a couple of papers, one by Persinger at Laurentian University, talking about sending out a very complex signal into the environment that would entrain the brains of people. Entrainment means your brain locks onto these external signals that are relatively weak, but they hit a specific frequency, a window frequency that causes certain reactions within the mind. In this case, shifting the emotional state. In fact, it was, again, Zbigniew Brzezinski in Between Two Ages was talking about this, and he was citing J.F. Gordon MacDonald, a geophysicist who said, if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate the behavior of people over large geographic areas. And the idea was that we could get this entrainment effect through an ELF signal, an extremely low frequency signal generated by pulsing a signal up into the ionosphere that causes the ionosphere then to change from DC to AC, and it acts like a big broadcast antenna in the sky, pulsing at that pulse rate of that high frequency signal, punching at it, if you will, and causing it to vibrate at a specific rate. Now then what happens is that wavelength penetrates the earth and sea, penetrates man, and in a certain range, the ELF range causes this entrainment effect, or this locking on effect, where then the emotional state is shifted. So it can be done with a system like HAARP. It can be done on a much smaller scale using any electromagnetic oscillation, whether it be the electric grid to your house, the internet, telephone, radio. You can oscillate, modulate signals rather on carriers that can cause that kind of an effect. So emotional manipulation is pretty easy, but they can do much, much more. In fact, there was a great paper at the U.S. Army War College in their quarterly back in '98 called "The Mind Has No Firewalls," and we quote it in a book that I wrote called "Controlling the Human Mind," which gets into all of these technologies. Over 250 sources are cited in that book alone, from big systems like HAARP to small systems designed to target an individual. And then looking at sort of the flip side, what can you do to enhance human performance with these technologies? And I think that's the more exciting area, and an area that is gaining a lot more currency and a lot more interest today than it ever has before.
You've mentioned Ben Eastland. Another name I hear is Ron Bass. Is this really not an extension of Tesla's research?
Sure. In fact, it's actually cited. Nikola Tesla invented the whole system of AC current generation and AC motors, all of it. And his ideas going back to the early 1900s on particle beam weapons is what we would probably call them today, or at least throw them in that class, electromagnetic systems to create weapon systems. He was talking about that in World War I, World War II, these ideas. And Ben Eastland actually read some of those papers, was stimulated by them, actually references them in one or two of his patents as being the sort of the motivation behind some of this. And yeah, Tesla had great ideas. Some of the ideas of beaming energy from one place on the planet to another was Tesla. The idea of energy transfers, the idea of manipulating weather systems, knocking out aircraft using energy as the weapon. All these things were the stuff of Tesla and the stuff he talked about, and some of which he actually perfected. Unfortunately, most of what he was doing was lost with the man. It's way ahead of his time, and I think we're still unraveling some of the knots that Tesla left tied for us to figure out.
Was he working for the government, designing military projects?
Death, no, he was pretty alienated. He died in poverty in New York City. I think the FBI seized most of his records after he died under immigration issues, but he was an American citizen. Didn't make a lot of sense. They basically grabbed the pile of files. Some of them ended up back in the former Yugoslavia and Serbia today. Others disappeared forever. I think that's one of those lingering sort of mysteries. Whatever happened to all of Tesla's working models, all of his stuff. And you'll see Tesla devices show up from time to time. I saw a dithermia unit even here in Alaska some years ago, which was used for healing. It was developed by one of Tesla's companies back in the 20s. So you never know what you might run into. And keep an eye out. You see that nameplate on something, you might take an image of the circuit. You never know what you might have just run into, because that hardware is laying all over the country these days.
We've got a Tesla here in our own backyard with John Hutchison up in New Westminster. Yeah. Right.
Doing some very creative stuff and doing some interesting work. And
having the government seize it all from time to time.
Yeah, sometimes they come in and they clean out his closet for him, so I guess he doesn't have to. You got to keep a sense of humor about some of this stuff because there's a lot of paranoid people out in the world. Most of them are in the government. Those people doing independent research, God bless you. That's where the airplane got invented. Mr. Coffee came along, and we got a home computer. So thank God for the independent scientists, because otherwise nothing would ever get done on this planet, I think.
Considering that you've had this background in politics with your father and your brother working for the United States government, what's your theories on this New World Order, North American Union, Illuminati? Any credence to this?
Well, in terms of economic zones, this is the scheme of bankers. Look at what happened in Europe. Sure, it's going to be attempted here. Stand in the way. Don't let it happen. Take it from my friends in Europe. Combined currencies don't work. They create bondage to banks. Unless you want to work for the banks your whole life, forget about it. Make sure you stand up in Canada and the United States and shut off these common currencies. They don't work. In fact, we ought to be headed a different direction. Put something behind the paper besides the promise of a government that can't control the presses. Put currency back on some kind of a basis that matters to people. Get some metal behind it, so to speak. And I'm not talking about guns, which has been the traditional way of enforcing currency rules in the recent past. Mm-hmm. The fact is, common currencies don't work. Open trade between economies that are relatively similar. I mean, for Canadians and Americans to trade freely, it makes good sense. I mean, we're all on the level playing field. South of the border, in Mexico, the land of corruption, guns, and money, forget it. I mean, they're not even on the same game. They're worrying about one tortilla a day. 10% of the adult population is running away. They're running away. 10% of the adult population are leaving en masse, trying to escape the tyranny that exists on our southern border under the guise of democracy. I mean, the best thing we can do for the folks south of the border is not combine our economies, teach them how to shoot guns and give them one and let them have their own revolution. Because by God, they deserve one. They got the most corrupt government in this hemisphere, and they're at our border, and we wave around a flag like they're our friends. It's corruption at the core. We have a lot of it, too. We just institutionalize ours, I think, the further north you go. But the point is, people deserve their own self-determination. And if we're not enhancing the opportunities for self-determination with our own citizens and the citizens of those on our borders, how can we even think about having a common economic zone if we don't have a common zone of liberty first?
Well, globalization is a reality, though, if it's not already here. So how do you become nationalist or push nationalism when globalization is inevitable?
Well, within the sovereign borders of a country is a culture that exists, and I think we need to recognize those cultures don't always blend so smoothly. I mean, we're playing around in the Middle East where people really want a theocracy. They want religious-based government. They're entitled to religious-based government, ladies and gentlemen, because it's their government to have and their government to get and their government to throw out, as long as they stay in their sovereign borders. And in a world of globalization, we need to recognize people's self-determination isn't going to the next McDonald's. It's not about the industries. And that's where nationalism and globalism clash, because globalism isn't about patriotism, it isn't about people, it isn't about culture. It's about selling you the next burger and collecting the next nickel to pay off a national debt, to pay off some arms company. The game being played is a game being played on every citizen, no matter where you live, and it's the same players. They get us fighting over the social issues, the political issues, other issues that do matter, but in the big picture, all of us are being robbed. That's really it. I think we can have globalization, but based on human values and the recognition of individual and a country's sovereignty and cultural sovereignty as well. Something we lost sight of in the course of the world. What's good for us may not be good for everyone else. A McDonald's on every corner might not be desirable in some parts of the world, believe it or not. I can tell you, when we start stomping on culture, globalism can work, but it can work out of a platform of respect rather than dominance.
Well, isn't that why they have to bomb these ancient civilizations to bring them up to speed here and get those McDonald's in there? And Make sure that Damascus is destroyed so Monsanto can get in there, and Halliburton, and
well, unfortunately, follow the money, and you see who benefits by these things, and it is multinationals. They get invited to clean up the mess. They get invited to make the mess. I mean, how much better does it get if you're running a cash register based on being the janitor for the planet?
Right, and you're printing the money. It's unbelievable.
And you're printing the money.
So what is the solution? It's not rioting. Is it protesting? Is it letters to your local representative?
Hey, it's all of those things depending on where you live and how government responds. In the Middle East, it's a little more violent than maybe we'd like it in what we think of as the cultured West. But there's an answer for all of it somewhere on the planet. The reason we have a Second Amendment in the United States is to keep everybody honest. Hopefully we never have to pull them out. I don't advocate that. I don't think we need to. I think we have a lot more distance to travel. Violence isn't the best course. It's the worst course because it gives everyone the license to end the revolution. Keep it alive by thinking, using our heads, calming ourselves, getting away from fear. Fear is the enemy in all of this. In the calm light of day, we'll make different decisions, continue to influence the political process, and don't give it up. That's what I think we can do. Each of us has a role to play. Exercise that role within our sphere of influence, whether it's talking to our friends, families, or more than that. Let's all do our part at the end of the day. Maybe the revolution can still happen.
The book is Angels Don't Play This HAARP. It's a cult classic. Buy it off of Amazon. Today's guest has been Nick Begich. What's the website?
It's earthpulse.com, EARTHPULSE, earthpulse.com. You can check out all our books and videos. And we appreciate everyone's support. Appreciate the time with you on the radio today.
Dr. Nick Begich, thank you so much for being on The West Coast Truth.